podcast, an inside look at California politics in the state legislature. I'm your host, Assemblyman Josh Hoover, and excited to have back on the show today Tom Sheehy from the Sheehy Strategy Group. Welcome back to the podcast.
Thank you very much, Mr. Hoover, for having me back. I really appreciate it. It's great to see you. And I love listening to your podcasts.
All right, I'm glad.
All of your guests, they're all awesome.
We've had some really great people on this year. And, you know, when you were on here in January, and our listeners will come to learn probably that if you're on the show, it means we're probably talking about the budget. So that's what we're going to talk about a little bit later today. You know, obviously the governor has released his May revision to, you know, a number of thoughts, and there's lots to talk about there. So we'll definitely get into that. But first off, just how are things going? How's the year treating you here in the Capitol?
Well, thank you very much for asking. We've been really busy, so we're really happy and fortunate to have the work that we do. We're relieved that the first House suspense hearing is over. You may want to talk about that a little bit. We saw a couple really important bills to our clients that didn't make it, that we're happy they didn't make it, and vice versa. So, you know, things are going okay.
That's good. That's good. Yeah. And we'll definitely get into the appropriations suspense file and kind of talk a little bit about the dynamics of that. I did want to start off. So since you've come on, we've kind of started this thing where we've polled the listeners a little bit. So every week we'll put a poll question on our X Twitter page at Point of Order Pod. This week, the question, the Joint Legislative Audit Committee met last week, and I had presented an audit that essentially is going to look into the timing, the legality, the effectiveness of state telework. Essentially coming from the standpoint of I represent a lot of state workers in my district. Heard from hundreds of them actually about you know, this order that the governor has now imposed that by June 17th, every state employee actually is going to be ordered back to the office at least 2 days a week. Now, there are obviously a lot of jobs where in-person work is the most effective. And about 70% of the state currently is doing that in person. But about 30% of the jobs right now are being done 100% telework, which is also something, by the way, the private sector has embraced quite a bit as well. And so my audit's just going to look at, you know, how effective has telework been, and could we actually, you know, continue to find some areas to continue using it and maybe even save some money on the buildings and operations. But the question this week is going to be, should the state eliminate full-time telework for all state employees or continue to allow it in the jobs where it makes sense? So we'll see what the listeners think of that. Again, you can vote at Point of Order Pod on X Twitter page. Any thoughts on that? I mean, I know you've been around this place for a long time. I know you probably have some thoughts on this topic.
Well, first of all, I think if you're a government worker, state government worker in this area, it'd be really, really nice to have it as an option.
Sure.
And I totally understand the arguments that you and others have made that there are benefits to the environment. We have less cars on the road, less emissions, less traffic to get downtown, less wear and tear on employee vehicles.
Yeah.
And then as you mentioned, also less facility usage, less maintenance. All those things are pluses. I'm going to turn the tables on, not turn the tables. I'm going to widen the discussion a little bit and give you a little bit of pushback from a organizational standpoint and from an employee and human resource development standpoint. I think the biggest problem with employees that want to telework 100%, or even more than 50%, is that they don't have enough exposure to senior management in their organization. And if they want to be considered for leadership roles, or if they want to be considered for senior promotions, they got to have face time with the director of the department, or if you're in a corporate setting with the CEO or the executive management of the company. And young employees don't really understand that. It's not until you've had a few battle scars that you realize that, oh, gee, if I had only had more face time with the boss, maybe I would have got that promotion. So on the one hand, I understand why it's very attractive because of the additional benefits of teleworking. But I think in the long term, for men and women's careers, it's not a plus.
Yeah.
So if I was so I will actually agree with Governor Newsom in this case, and maybe not agree with all of your constituents, who you're doing a great job of representing, by the way. And I would say that a return to work for everybody, at least 1 or 2 days a week, I think is really important. And I think for employees' careers, it's really important.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting, right? I think there's a lot of merit to that, and I think, as I mentioned, it's funny how this story gets talked about because there's almost this misconception that like everyone's at home right now,
Right.
working, where 70% of the state employee full-time workforce is still in person. And so, this obviously is a smaller percentage, but I hear you. And I think, to be honest with you, for the employees that do want those opportunities to move up in their career, I would think that they're going to try to find those in-person options, right? And really try to find those roles where maybe they are in person half the week or the whole week. And so I certainly agree with you there. I think, the interesting part of all of this to me is that the private sector has really embraced telework. And one of my other concerns with the governor's decision is that we are going to be somewhat less competitive in some of these jobs with the workforce that is currently has these work from home options, And so, for example, I was touring, I won't say which business, but I was touring a very large business in my district a few months ago.
I know which one.
And the building was empty. I mean, it's like, I was asking him about that, like, so, where are all the people? And they're like, we really embraced telework during the pandemic, and our employees wanted to keep it that way.
Yeah.
And so, that's a whole nother crisis brewing on all of this commercial office space.
Yeah.
Like, what do we do with it?
Yeah.
And another concern that I get, from local leaders here in Sacramento, right, is they want to see the revitalization of downtown Sacramento, which I do not represent, but I do fully understand that sentiment. And so I think there's a lot that we can do to do that. I think we've already started converting some of these buildings to housing. I think that's a really important part of it. But we also have to solve our homelessness crisis down here. And until we do that, I just really feel, that's going to encourage people to come back, I think.
If it's okay with you, I'd like to make one more comment and respond to the downtown issue. It was very sad for those of us that work downtown pre-pandemic. Sacramento was really on the verge, I think, with DOCO and the Kings. I think we were really on the verge of sort of moving from a government town to something bigger and better, okay? Not to say that we're just a government town, but it's had that, reputation for a long time because of all the state workers. The pandemic just wiped out downtown.
It did.
And, I was fortunate because I have my own business and I was able to keep coming downtown to my office, and I saw it. We still have small businesses down here that are boarded up, or where small businesses used to be. And I am of the opinion that we'll never fully recover until more state employees are coming back downtown, because a lot of these businesses were built on that foot traffic. So that is another important issue I think we need to think about. I know you don't represent downtown, but that's an important issue.
Yeah, for sure. Well, and I think, a couple days a week hybrid schedule. So the governor's order is basically 2-day a week minimum, which, certainly will have an impact. I wonder how big of an impact it will have. I think if those workers were coming back 5 days a week, it would obviously be even better for the businesses, right? But we're going to have to wait and see on how this plays out. I do expect the governor to continue, this to still happen, and so we will see. But it's interesting if you I'm trying to remember here the statistics off the top of my head, but we're going to get into the budget discussion in a little bit here.
Sure.
And one of the really interesting things that I actually didn't, I think there's a lot of arguments on both sides on what the governor chose to do here. But one of the reasons he chose to do it was budgetary savings. That one didn't make sense to me. So essentially what he's saying is we would get rid of this telework stipend. So during the pandemic, we actually encouraged people to work from home during the pandemic, and we actually offered like an extra financial benefit. Now, based on the employees that I've talked to, every single one that I've talked to actually has said they would give that up in a heartbeat to keep working from home, right? So I think you could probably cut that stipend without a lot of turmoil. But the real budgetary savings, I think, are going to come from all of the state office buildings that we operate and all of these the rent that we pay for. I mean, it's a ton of money.
Yeah.
It's a much larger number than that stipend costs our state budget.
Yeah.
And so it'll be interesting to see if after all these folks come back, in the future, does the governor look at this as a potential budgetary, item? I don't know. So we'll have to wait and see.
That will be very interesting to see what that analysis is.
Yeah, I don't know. So I'm interested to get the results of the audit. And I think one of the things we asked the auditor too was just, what is the potential savings to the state, right?
Yep.
For telework. So yeah, so you've got 2 votes here.
Okay.
And I actually love I love it when we can have these back and forths, because I feel like we get people on the podcast and then all of a sudden they just don't want to talk about things where they disagree. And I'm like, no, that's more fun that way.
More fun.
Like let's have a
more
discussion. So should the
You're
state,
selling out the state workers.
So should the state eliminate full-time telework for all state employees or continue to allow it in the jobs where it makes sense? You can go vote on that at Point of Order Pod on our Twitter X page. So we'll leave that there. Just to jump in, I know we want to talk about the budget, but I wanted to hit on a couple stories that happened over the last week. The big one you already mentioned, which was the appropriation suspense hearing.
Yes.
So for the listeners that might not know, I mean, a lot of the folks that listen to this podcast may already know this, but when you get a bill, you introduce a bill, it gets referred to a policy committee. That committee debates it and decides whether to vote it out or not. And then once it gets voted out, it goes to the Appropriations Committee, which does not look at things from a policies perspective, or at least they're not supposed to. They look at things from a fiscal perspective. How much cost is this going to have on the state? And if it's over a certain threshold, it goes to the suspense file, which is kind of this mysterious thing to a lot of people. But basically, I think it's just a lot different from the standpoint of a regular committee hearing. You're hearing testimony and all these things. That suspense day hearing, I mean, you've been at it a million times, where it's just like, this bill gets out, this bill dies, this bill gets out, this bill is held, and it's just...
of course, it's all fiscal. There's no politics involved.
Oh, exactly, right? Yeah. I know, that's what they say. They say it's all fiscal, but we know, I mean, there's always some politics at play and everything, but I think it is a very unique hearing, and it's a day where pretty much everyone in the building is tuned in to, did my bill, is it moving forward or not? What were your thoughts on the hearing this year?
Well, I thought it was interesting. There's been some good stats compiled on this. Historically, if you look at both houses combined, about 25% of the bills on suspense get held. And this year, I think with the Senate and the Assembly combined, there are about 1,009 bills that were on suspense, and 32% of them got held. So there was a higher percentage.
Yeah.
And I think the Senate held about 35% of the bills, and the Assembly held about 25%. Of course, there were more bills in the Assembly because there's more members. I think that this is reflective of the fact that everybody understands, you and your colleagues understand, we have a real fiscal crisis on our hands. There's some very difficult budget cuts that have been included in the governor's budget, the May revision. And unfortunately, if we look at the long-term forecast, we're probably going to see more of it. So I wasn't surprised to see so many bills held. You seem to do pretty well. We were chatting about that. Some of your colleagues did pretty well. Others didn't do quite as well. I do think the biggest cost bills were held. So, for example, AB 2200 by somebody in Colorado.
I was just going to say that,
That is a bill, no matter how you feel about universal health care, you can't deny the fact that would be a major restructuring of our tax structure. It would take all private sector health care, put in government. Huge, huge costs involved. I wasn't surprised to see that bill held. There are other bills that didn't have as high as a price tag, and they were held. It's sort of a mixed bag. But there were other bills that have been tagged as job killers by the California Chamber of Commerce. For example, Assembly Member Haney, your colleague, had the "Don't Call Me" bill.
The right to disconnect.
The right to disconnect bill. Or,
I forget what.
Or please don't call me after 5 bill. That was tagged as a job killer by the chamber, and I saw that one was held.
That was held, yeah.
Another one that I think probably got some headlines was Senator Wiener's bill on psychedelics was held.
That's right. Yeah.
That's an interesting one because I don't think that one was too expensive, but maybe the time just isn't right yet to legalize some of those substances, even though there's a lot of potential benefit there. So I think there's an interesting mix of fiscal. One other thing that your listeners may want to know, in a year like this with such a difficult budget challenge ahead of you and your colleagues, it is common for the governor's office to pick up the phone and call the chairs of these committees and to call the pro tem and the speaker and say, gee, we got a tough situation here. Let's use some extra restraint.
Yeah.
I know that when I was staff in the building and I staffed those committees, we got phone calls from the governor and members of the governor's cabinet asking us to use extra consideration of what we let out. So I think you've got that factor going on as well.
For sure. Yeah, I mean, I think you hit on some really good ones that I was looking at too. Another one that got held was Assembly Bill 1999. So this was the Irwin bill dealing with this PUC fixed charge for electricity rates that we actually talked about on the podcast last week with Greg Wallace. And that, that's been just a big topic of discussion the whole year. But it's interesting because the PUC just ruled on that, and then this bill got held, and so it looks like that's going to be moving forward as is at this point. But yeah, I mean, just a lot of things. It looks like the plastic bag ban bill moved forward, as well as let's see what else. Some of the AI bills moving forward. The bills on autonomous vehicles moving forward.
It's ironic, the Irwin bill, if you think about it, because you and your colleagues didn't get a lot of opportunity to vet that policy last year when it was stuck in a budget trailer bill at the last minute. And now you've got a policy bill where everybody has a chance to vet it, talk about it, kick the tires, look under the hood, and then it got stopped in its tracks. So that's it's the way the building works sometimes.
It really is. It's really interesting, and that's kind of what we were complaining about last week is just the cautions of legislating policy through the budget process. It just doesn't, it's just not transparent. It's not as good for the public. Just a lot of frustrations there. And now some bipartisan frustrations, which is, always welcome, right? Also, a host of retail bills got out. But yeah, there's just a lot that, lot of things moving forward. A lot of things got held. We'll be getting into more of that as we move through the legislative session this year. I know there's a lot of debate. So this week actually is our House of Origin deadline, and so all of our bills this week by Friday of this week, all of our assembly bills have to be passed out of the assembly, likewise in the Senate, and then they get to start the process going through the other house, and that is, always a different lens. I think that there's always some more challenges when you're going through a house that you're less familiar with, and so. Lots to discuss on that moving forward.
Do you think you'll have to still be working the file on Friday, or you think you'll wrap up on Thursday?
I hope we're done on Thursday. I mean, that's just my personal. I think everyone would probably rather go late on Thursday than come back on Friday. But we'll see what happens. It's not up to me, so I just do it. I'm just sitting there until they decide they're done. So I am going to have a few bills though this week. I was really thankful to get two of my top priority bills. I have a bill that would limit smartphone use in schools, that the chair of the Appropriations Committee also feels very strongly about. And so I was grateful for her support on that one, getting out of Appropriations suspense. And then the really big one I got out was AB 2903, which is essentially my bill to implement the state auditor's recommendations on homelessness spending transparency.
Boy, do we need more transparency
desperately.
There. Thank you very much for championing that issue.
Absolutely. And, honestly, I was a little worried about it because the agencies don't love it.
Yeah.
They want more money for it. And they tagged it with something like a $3.5 million price tag, which I think is actually unreasonable. I think we're going to be working on some things in the Senate to hopefully clarify some of this. But the transparency part is to help us use the money better. And so we need to at least be spending some money to make sure we're tracking where all the money is going.
Well, look, we're all of us that care about California, and I mean that sincerely, are really glad you've got a bipartisan group of your colleagues working on this. The homelessness problem is not going away anytime soon. We have spent billions of dollars on it. We just want to make sure we're spending our money on the types of assistance that's actually working.
Totally.
It's actually helping people get their lives back and learn how to live in homes and apartments again and not sleep on the street. And they need to get the mental health treatment and the drug treatment, all that. But we've got to figure out what works and what doesn't. And if our different levels of government can't tell us that, can't tell us what's working and what's not, and where we're getting the biggest bang for the buck, then we're shooting in the dark.
Absolutely.
So thank you for that.
No, absolutely. And I'm very excited and hopeful in the Senate. Well, obviously it's got to go through this whole process again, but we're hopeful that we're going to have some bipartisan support for that.
Fingers crossed.
As we have so far.
Fingers crossed.
So this coming week, we've got 918 bills in both houses that remain that we're going to be working through. All have to be passed by Friday, hopefully Thursday. So going to be a lot to report back on that next week. Another interesting topic I like to talk about, and we can talk about it more in the context of the budget in a little bit, but the Capitol Annex project, obviously, is something that's been something I've been keeping my eye on. Essentially, we've torn down half of the Capitol where the governor and legislative staff and members' offices used to be. It was known as the Capitol Annex. It is no longer there. So if you go look, it's just a bunch of construction right now, but there's no building. There's some pending lawsuits. It looks like it's going to be delayed. The governor has also shifted money from the general fund to bond funding. And so that's going to be a really interesting one. Apparently I've got a bad link, so my story's not coming up here, but essentially there's a lot of questions on, I think the goal was 2025. I don't think that is going to be a reasonable goal anymore, but I didn't know if you had kept track of the Capitol Annex story at all. A little bit, yeah. So I agree with you. I think the timing of it is going to get pushed back. It's not going to, I think originally it was supposed to be done by the 26, 27. I think you might be right, actually. But I think we're going to lose another year or two. It's just inevitable in a large project like that. I think, the governor made a choice that I think most governors would have, which is to, in a situation like this with the budget being as bad as it is, to shift from a straight general fund cash pay as you go to revenue bond financing. He called it a fund shift, but it's really just more long-term debt. Well, it raises the cost. It does raise the cost. I mean, so, you could sit here and criticize the governor and say, well, you should have continued to do pay as you go, but he's juggling a lot of difficult decisions in the state budget like this. So I think that was inevitable that he'd do that. But it does raise the long-term cost. It does add to the state's indebtedness. It's not really it is technically a fund shift, but it's really just taking on more debt. But that was a relatively easy decision for the governor to make, I think. It probably was. And the thing is with that, right, the building's not there. Right. So it's not like you can really undo this at this point. The building has been demolished. Right. Now, there is an argument to be made, and this is going to be a controversial take for any of the staffers listening. I have been fine with the swing space. Now, there is a lot of controversy when it comes to the elevator situation. You've probably got stuck in that line a couple times. Man, I got to get in better shape. I should be walking up the stairs instead of standing in line. You almost have to, but even if you use the stairs, the line to get into the building is the other, it's just around the block. And I mean, honestly, we need to work on this. We need to figure out some sort of solution because it is really difficult right now getting into this building some days. The month of April was really tough. I think June's going to be really tough. I agree with you completely, Josh. I think that the traffic in and out of the building and up and down those elevators is a real choke point. It's a problem. Yeah. And if the elevators and the line were working a little more smoothly, I think you could make the argument that we've already got this building we're in. We don't, delay the annex, whatever, push it off. I don't know. But you can't really make that. It's harder to make that argument when you're having trouble getting people into the building and expressing their voice to their representatives. So I don't know. It's a tough situation for sure. Well, they're going to have to do something. They knocked everything down, so they're going to have to. Yeah, they got to put something. They got to put something there. Yeah. So it's just. It's an interesting situation. I had some real issues with the whole, demolition thing from the beginning, but at this point now it's done, right? Yeah. So we have to figure something out. So it'll be an interesting story to follow. There's another story. I didn't know if you saw this one in Politico. I was interviewed for this story, and I did not really know the full context of it at the time. I got a call from a reporter like, we just want to talk about EVs. I'm like, okay, cool. I'll talk about EVs. I drive an EV. It's fine. Greg Wallace actually called me out on that on my podcast last week. He's like, you drive an EV, right? I'm like, thanks for calling me out. So this week I'm calling myself out. But essentially, just talking about, kind of some of the benefits of EV technology and things like that from a Republican standpoint. And apparently one of the things that, he had asked me about is, so, you like EVs, but you don't support the governor's executive order to get rid of gas-powered vehicles by 2035. Wallace asked you this? No, the Politico did. Politico did, right? And I said, no, I don't. Yeah. I said, just because I think there's some merit to EV technology does not mean that they should be forced on every individual in the state. I mean, that's not a free market. That doesn't make any sense.
Exactly.
Right? Like,
yeah.
And so he was kind of like, oh, interesting. You know, because it's like almost like if you like an EV or drive an EV, then you have to support them mandated on everyone.
Right.
Which I don't.
Doesn't make
I
any sense.
fundamentally don't. Right.
Well, yeah, it's a silly mandate, really. I think to say that we're going to get rid of gasoline powered vehicles in California. I mean, not in our lifetime.
No.
Okay, not in our lifetime. You know, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles have a longer range than battery electric vehicles. You drive a battery electric vehicle?
It's full battery.
Yeah. What's your range?
It's technically 300, realistically 250.
Well, see, you know, so if you're driving from here to LA, what do you do?
Yeah. Well,
and so people,
if you're driving from here to LA, you're stopping along the way.
People have range anxiety. Electric vehicles don't work as well in the mountains and in cold weather.
Oh, that is very true. Yeah.
Electric vehicles are very cool. The zero emission part of it is very good. There are other environmental issues with electric vehicles we're just finding out about now. That,
of course, production.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But I think a complete ban on gasoline powered vehicles is not likely. I drive a hybrid. I mean, I'm getting 31 miles to the gallon in a full-size SUV hybrid. I love it. I mean, you know, because the regular non-hybrid version of that car gets 15 miles to the gallon. So
that's
you know,
what my wife
I mean,
gets.
I'd like. Is that what you're? She drive an SUV?
Yeah.
I mean, so I'd like to think I'm doing my part for the environment, but you know, in my hybrid, I can drive from here to LA, and if I need to stop and get some gas, I can do that.
Yeah.
And I'm still helping the environment by, you know,
reducing
my emissions. So I think, you know, Politico's trying to drive a wedge and say, you know, Democrats support electric vehicles and Republicans don't. And the fact is, in California, a lot of Republicans support electric vehicles.
I think the story even noted like 20% of registered EVs are registered to Republicans or something like that. I don't know where they got that stat, but I know a lot of Republicans that drive EVs. I do agree with you, though. I think they're very good for specific purposes. I commute from here to Sacramento, Sacramento to Folsom every day. Never have a problem, right?
Perfect.
Never going more than 50 miles a day or whatever, right?
Vehicle.
Or I'm driving around my district, and it has saved me so much gas money driving around my district.
I believe it.
I will say.
What's it, $5.50 a gallon now? $6 a gallon?
It's nuts. Cost me $100 to fill my wife's car up the other day.
But
I also think that most families, you know, are not going to have two of them, right?
Right.
I think it makes a ton of sense to have one EV in your garage. You've got a plug to plug it in or whatever.
Right.
And then you've got a gas-powered vehicle or maybe some other technology in the future, but you know that is there for the long trips or the family trips or whatever it might be. Because you're right. I don't want to go to this, let's say, the Central Coast in my EV and get stranded. Like, you know, there's a lot of challenges there with logistics, and so and then you've got a lot of broken chargers and all kinds of other problems. So I think there's some really amazing applications for them. I know the technology is vastly improved from what it was even 5 years ago.
Oh yeah.
But there are limitations, and like everything, I'm a free market guy. You know, I think the people that want to buy EVs should have that option, but no, don't force a technology on, you know, everybody. I think it's
I completely agree, and I hope that in all of the state and federal subsidies on this issue, I hope they continue to subsidize the hydrogen market, because I do think that hydrogen fuel cell vehicles in the long run have better opportunity to help us with the environment and with our transportation needs than battery electric vehicles. There's a lot of advantages to hydrogen. The big problem, of course, is we don't have enough refueling stations now.
Oh, it's very the supply the supply of the fuel is very limited.
And then environmentalists care about whether it's, you know, green hydrogen or brown hydrogen. You've got those issues,
right?
But as a fuel cell technology, it's a great option for us.
Well, and I think in a lot of ways, like EVs, right? There's really great benefits from the emissions standpoint, but obviously some challenges from the production standpoint. It's the same with EVs. You know, I mean, it's great to have a vehicle that doesn't have any emissions. I love that. But at the end of the day, the pollution required to create these batteries and mine these substances is obviously there too. So you got to think about the whole process.
Totally.
Last thing, before we move on to the budget, I didn't know if you saw this story about Prop 22, but it's in court right now.
This is the Uber Lyft.
The Uber Lyft
challenge. The question is whether or not Prop 22 is going to be found to be valid.
Yeah, to be allowable, essentially. And there's obviously, this is now in the California Supreme Court. They just did oral arguments last week. I didn't know if you knew much about that story, but
So I don't know what the what the central legal issue is going to be, but I know the political issue. And AB5 had a major impact on the gig economy in the state,
for sure.
And if Prop 22 is thrown out, that's going to be a major monkey wrench for Uber, Lyft, and other gig economy companies. And there will be people that lose work and lose their jobs. Now, I understand that on the other side of that, they say, well, they don't get the same benefits. It's not as good of a job. And those things are all true. But those gig economy jobs are still important to people. And and in some cases, they're an entry point into the workforce where people can move on and get other jobs that have other benefits and other security that a gig job doesn't. I hope the Supreme Court doesn't throw Prop 22 out. But I'm watching that like you. I just don't know. I don't know how it got briefed legally. I don't know what the legal probability is.
The legal question is around essentially the legislature's constitutional power to create and enforce a workers' compensation system. So it's actually the challenge is focused on a really narrow part of the initiative.
Okay,
but it threatens the whole initiative,
right?
Because if that part gets overturned, then they could toss the whole thing out.
I see.
Which I think would be a huge problem. We've already seen, Uber. I think it was Uber, maybe Lyft as well, but I'm pretty sure I read Uber pulled out of Minnesota a few months ago or something, based on some legal change that just made it impossible for them to operate as a business in that state anymore. Obviously they don't want to lose California as a marketplace, but we are seeing this happen is when you push it too far and you try to, essentially require all of these things and these regulations that companies just can't operate.
Well, in 2020 and 2021, I had several clients that hired my firm, Sheehy Strategy Group, specifically to work with Lorena Gonzalez and her staff to get some carve-outs. Because one of them was tutoring. Companies that specialize in providing tutoring to high school students and middle school students, and they just couldn't operate on every tutor's going to be an employee type model.
Right, doesn't work.
And there were a lot of examples of that. And so
a lot.
I understand that there were some benefits to AB5 from the labor's perspective. I understand those arguments, and I wouldn't dispute them. I'm not sure they fully understand about how disruptive it was to the overall economy. There are a lot of niche businesses that need to have access to independent contractors, and to have a blanket law that says, you can't have independent contractors anymore, it's a real problem.
Well, it's a huge problem too for California because most states aren't doing that.
Right.
So it's a competitive disadvantage for businesses here in California and for independent workers here in California. My wife's been an independent contractor for a lot of her career, and she wants it that way.
Right.
And I think that was the frustrating thing about AB5 from 2019 is that there was thousands of independent contractors across the state that were saying, no, we want to be independent contractors. We don't want to be employees.
It's especially important to women. Women tend to need more flexibility in the workplace because more often than not, they're the primary caregiver to the children. Even if they have a partner that's helping them raise those kids, they still need more flexibility than men lots of times. And that was a big factor with a lot of those carve-outs in AB5.
It also is just again, just kind of government meddling where they don't need to meddle,
Totally
and I totally hear you on there were political reasons to do it and all this stuff, and that's true. But it's at a certain point, it's like allow people to work the jobs they want to work, how they want to work them. It should be between the business and the individual, not between the government shouldn't be putting their hand in that.
Well, the ABC test was just too simplified of a test to make a determination whether you're independent or not.
So we'll follow that one closely. I'm with you. I hope that Prop 22 doesn't get tossed out. I believe it got on the initial challenge, the initial court essentially overturned Prop 22. Then the appeals court disagreed with that decision. And so there have been two sets of processes that have gone two different directions already. And so now the Supreme Court has to make the final call.
It's a big California.
Big call. So definitely a big decision. We'll see what happens with that. But let's jump into the state budget. there's so much we can talk about, and I know you have limited amount of time, so I want to try to focus in on what the listeners would potentially find the most helpful. So we don't need to get I guess
into the nits and the
weeds,
gnats,
right? Yeah, but just give me maybe off the top your initial thoughts. So just to set the context, the governor came out in January, announced his state budget. Obviously, it didn't look great at that point, although there was a big disagreement between what the nonpartisan legislative analyst felt was a $73 billion deficit, and the governor said it was around $37.9 billion.
Yeah.
Okay. Those two numbers have kind of come together since then. And, the governor is admitting that it's going to be a little larger than that. I think the legislative analyst has shrunk their number a little bit. But what are your kind of initial thoughts to the May revise and kind of what the governor's plan is?
Well, first of all, let me just say, having worked for a couple of different governors that struggled with, really big budget deficits, I have a lot of empathy for Governor Newsom. It's a lousy position for a governor to be in. California's revenue structure really is very volatile. I think Jerry Brown did an exceptionally good job in managing the budget as a Democrat. Governor Newsom got some really big surpluses and let a few things get away from him fiscally, and now he's really paying the price for it.
Yeah.
I like to start by saying some good things about the budget because, some people say, oh, well, he just doesn't like Governor Newsom or, he's taking a partisan jab at him. And
Sure.
I really don't want to do that. I think that the first thing that we should say about this budget, and I'll talk about the difference between the LEO and the governor, try to put it in real simple terms so everybody will understand because it is confusing. But I think the first thing is that as a Republican or a Democrat, we should appreciate is that if you look at the governor's solutions, and he's got about $48 billion in budget solutions that he solved for between Jan 10 and the May revision, 90% of them are on the spending side.
Wow.
90%. Now, we may disagree. We may say some fund shifts and deferrals and this and that, whether that's good fiscal policy. But the governor's approach to balancing this budget for the time being is reducing spending. And that's a good thing.
Yeah.
And I think most people would agree with that. We got to live within our means. I think another good thing about the May revision is he backed away from using so much of the budget stabilization account or rainy day fund.
I did see that. Yeah.
And that'll really help you and your colleagues have some more flexibility in future years because both the Department of Finance and the LEO are saying we're going to have budget deficits in the future.
Yeah.
Despite the fact the governor says he solved the budget for the next 2 years, really the budgeting is still a 1 year at a time process. And I would be skeptical if somebody told me that next year's budget's already balanced. But so I think that was a good move, doing more reductions in spending and using less of the reserve. He did do some revenue enhancers, but if you think about it, the total amount of revenue enhancers he did was just $2 billion. I think we should talk about at least one of those, the NOL.
Yes, we should. We'll get to that.
That has
for sure.
some major policy implications. And then I think finally, I think for Democrats and Republicans, we should feel good about the fact that the governor is not taking apart any core services. A lot of the cuts were programs that were recently expanded or recently enacted. There was a lot of discretionary money given out. We call those projects of regional concern or PORC. A lot of that's being pulled back if those funds didn't get encumbered or liquidated. It's kind of funny. You see a lot of members in the morning report and other things saying that they were doing a ribbon cutting or a big, $5 million check cutting for the new community center. A lot of that money's being pulled back into the state treasury.
Yeah.
But so I think those are all good things. I think the what's not so good is that according to the LEO, even though the governor came down on his revenue estimate, the governor reduced his revenue estimate by $12 billion over the 3 years of the May revision. The 3 years being the past year, 22-23, the current year being 23-24 that we're in right now, and then the budget year that starts July 1st, which is 24-25. The governor came down a total of $12 billion, but that's still $13 billion more than the LAO. Now, $13 billion sounds like a really big number, and it is, but on a percentage basis, it's only really 3 or 4% of the total revenue estimate of the general fund. So they're not that far apart percentage-wise. But the point is that the governor's revenue numbers, despite being more realistic, are still rosy.
Yeah.
A number of the, I told you it's a good thing that the governor is focusing mostly on reducing spending, and that is a good thing. You and your colleagues should like that. But the flip side to that is a lot of his spending solutions are temporary.
Yep.
And what that means is that a year from now or 2 years from now, those costs are going to come back, and they're going to add to a future budget deficit. So if I was in your shoes, I would be concerned about that. A lot of the solutions are temporary. And by that, I mean specifically your fund shifts, your delays, your deferrals, accelerating reversions of state appropriations. Those are all things that you need to do in this situation, but they don't. What you want to do in budgeting, and any good budget analyst will tell you this, is you want to align your long-term revenue with your long-term expenditures. If you don't, you get like a fish mouth where the expenditures are here, the revenues are here, and that gap in between is the budget deficit. What you want to do is you want to close the fish mouth. When I staffed Governor Schwarzenegger, he'd say, "We got to close the fish mouth." And the governor was right. You've got to close the fish mouth, but you've got to do that in the long run, not the short term. So I'd be concerned about that. There's a significant economic risk. There's a significant risk to their economic forecast. Their economic forecast assumes that interest rates will come down and inflation will be under control. Of course, we all want that. Interest rates are driving higher costs for consumers, whether they be automobiles or other things they have to finance. If interest rates don't come down and inflation continues to be a problem, and of course those two are linked, then the revenue forecast that the governor has is going to take some real hits. So that'd be something I'd be concerned about. Now you get to this issue of whose numbers are right. And I will say that I'm disappointed that the Newsom administration has made this whole what is the budget deficit question as obfuscated as it is, because it doesn't need to be that way.
Let me ask you about that, okay? Because this was from the beginning, you know, of this whole May Revise discussion, something I noticed very clearly. Now, the media didn't always pick up on it, but I felt, and maybe you don't have to answer this exactly, but like you've been in these conversations behind the scenes, it felt intentional to me that the governor's team felt, you know, we're going to try to like make this look a little better than it is. And how are we going to do that? Well, what the governor did is the legislature passed an early action proposal a few weeks ago that dealt with about $17.3 billion of things. Then he came out in his May Revise and said, we only need to solve a $27 billion problem. Well, the problem with that, a lot of the media picked it up and said, well, the governor says the deficit's only $27.9 billion. Well, no, that's not actually what the governor said. What the actual deficit is closer to $45 billion, right? So, like, what do you think? I mean, obviously, I assume this is what you're talking about, but it has been, all these different numbers have been thrown out there and kind of clouded the issue a little bit, you know?
Well, look, I don't want to take a gratuitous shot at the governor, but I do think there was some politics involved because there is, you know. The national media is picking this up. He's got a national profile now because of everything that he's been doing politically. So I do think there was some politics involved. And I will just say this. I will say that, you know, in the 25 plus years I've been in the game, I've never seen it be this confusing. And I think it was intentional. I think it really was intentional. But let's try to demystify it a little bit. And I really like, the legislative analyst is a nonpartisan office, and they're staffed with really smart people. I'm not saying they're smarter than the staff of Department of Finance. And full disclosure, you know, I have a bias. I spent 7 years at the Department of Finance. 3 of those years, 3 or 4 of those years as a budget analyst, and then three years as part of the executive management of the department. So I saw from both sides. So I'm a big fan of the California Department of Finance, but they work for the governor. Right?
Okay. You got to know that.
So you got to know that. So the governor says in the May Revise that he solved for a $27 or $28 billion problem. This is after the early action of the $17 billion. And by the way, we should talk about that early action on the $17 billion. Out of that $17 billion, only $3.4 billion of it were actual budget cuts.
Correct.
The rest was what I was talking about, fund shifts, deferrals, delays, and borrowing. All things that he probably had to do, but it wasn't really $17 billion of closing the fish mouth. It was really only $3 billion of closing the fish mouth. But the analyst said that, so the governor said he was solving for $28 billion at the May Revise. What the ledge analyst says is that the governor was really solving for a $55 billion budget deficit. And so if you look at the difference in the May Revise, so if you look at the difference between what the nonpartisan ledge analyst says, which is that the May Revise, this is after the $17 billion, right, sells for $55 billion, and the governor said it was 28 or 27, the difference is $28 billion. So what is that? What makes it up? Because the LAO also says that their overall view of the situation is not that much different than the governor.
That's what I read,
So what is this $28 billion? That's really the key to understanding this. And I'm going to tell you right now. $22 billion of that is directly related to Prop 98.
Okay.
The governor's January budget and May revise assume that the Prop 98 spending levels for the past year, the current year, and the budget year all are lowered to the minimum guarantee based upon the current revenue estimate. Furthermore, this is the big one, and that's $22 billion. All $22 billion in reduction for K-12 and community colleges, that's all baked in here. But what the governor did, and by the way, that doesn't happen automatically.
Right.
You've got to bring a bill to the assembly floor to reduce Prop 98 because you set levels for the 2-3 and 3-4 fiscal year, and those are going to have to be fixed, those levels, because you set them too high because they were based on a higher revenue amount. Right. I think the listeners to this podcast probably know the higher the state general fund revenues, the higher the Prop 98 guarantee is going to be.
Yeah.
But what the governor does is his budget assumes we go to the minimum, but then he calls that a baseline adjustment. He doesn't call it a policy adjustment. And it's all the policy adjustments that define what the budget deficit is. So let's talk about it. What is a budget deficit? It's very simple, actually. It's not complicated. If you look at state government today with all the laws that are on the books, all the laws that are currently active, and you say, how much money does it take to run state government today, to run the California State Treasury and the Comptroller's Office and finance and the legislature and all the different things that state government does that's funded by the general fund, there's a cost to that. If the cost is $1 and only 90 cents of revenue come in, then you have a 10-cent budget deficit. So the deficit is the difference between the amount of money you need to run state government at its current level of service versus how much revenue comes in. That's what a budget deficit is. So the Prop 98 dropping $22 billion is part of the budget deficit, but the governor just wanted to redefine that as a workload adjustment, non-policy. But you can't really do that because he's still going to ask you to vote on a bill. Yeah. It is a policy choice. So the first thing to understand is 22 out of that $28 billion was a reclassification from a policy decision, which changing the Prop 98 guarantee is a policy decision to simply say, oh, well, that's just a workload adjustment. No, well, it doesn't work that way. Prop 98 is not automatic. You've got to vote on it. There was about $6 billion in similar type things where the governor said, oh, this is a workload adjustment. And it wasn't a workload adjustment. You're going to have to vote on it. It's a policy adjustment. So again, the governor in the May revise says he's solving for a $27 billion problem. The analyst says it's really a $55 billion problem. There's a $28 billion gap. Yeah. That is almost entirely related to the governor reclassifying workload budget adjustments from what really is a policy consideration for the legislature. So you've got that. You've also got differences in the revenue estimate, but that's not really the major difference. The major difference is how he's handling Prop 98. When I talked earlier about some of the things in the budget we don't like, there's one that I forgot, but it's perfect for this point in the conversation because within that $22 billion Prop 98 reclassification to just being a workload budget, there's a special maneuver that the governor does that was really called out by the Legislative Analyst's Office. They almost never use language as strongly as they do. They call it a Prop 98 maneuver. And this, at first, when I first read about this in January, I was scratching my head, go, what is this? I've never seen anything like it. And there never has been anything like this. But I want to explain it because it's almost $9 billion. It's $8.8 billion. Here's what that's all about. And it's embedded in this $22 billion number. Because the last budget we did last summer assumed a much higher level of revenue than actually came in. We lost about almost 25% of the revenue by the time it was finally collected in the fall. And we all know it's because of the delay in the federal government tax collections and all that. Yeah. The Prop 98 level for the past year, the 22-23 fiscal year, was set at a much higher level. And so that year's over now because we're now in the 23-24 fiscal year. So what do you do? I mean, if you wanted to be a fiscal purist, you'd have to go in, lower the guarantee, and pull that money back from the schools, which would cause all sorts of havoc.
Right, exactly.
Politically, nobody would like that. Yeah. But here's what the governor's budget does. The governor's budget assumes the lower expenditure level. Right. What it really
from the past year.
It assumes that for the past year, for the 22-23 fiscal year, it just assumes, well, the Prop 98 guarantee dropped $8 billion. We'll just assume we're spending $8. But the actual cash went out the door. Right. And so you've got almost $9 billion, it's $8.8 billion in cash that went out the door to K-12 and community colleges. But the governor assumes, well, no, we're just at the minimum guarantee there. So embedded in his savings are savings for something that actually never happened. Now, how does he deal with that? He says, well, starting next year in the 25-26 budget, we will recognize those expenditures, $1.6 billion over the next 5 budget years. So 1.6 times 5, we'll recognize that $8 billion over 5 future years. The reason why he was able to get away with this, Josh, is because unlike when I worked for Schwarzenegger, we had a similar budget crisis. Back then, we didn't have any cash. We had a cash crisis, not just a budget crisis.
Right.
This governor's fortunate. He's got a budget crisis, but he's loaded with cash. Well, the state is. The state, he's got, I should say, Governor Newsom and his colleagues in the administration have a lot more options on how to deal with the situation because there's a lot of cash. And because there's a lot of cash, they're able to do this special Prop 98 maneuver. Now, it's terrible fiscal policy.
Yeah.
The LAO said in the strongest possible terms to the legislature, reject that because it opens a can of worms. If you do it for this year, what do you do it for next year?
For sure.
And again, the only reason why you can do this is because the state has so much cash on hand. But it's really bad fiscal policy. And
so when you say he's going to recognize it moving forward, so essentially he's just saying, we're just assuming you spent less last year and anything extra is just extra money that you will then. I mean, but what if the schools have already spent that money?
They've spent the money for accounting. So they spent the money.
I think that's the big question.
But for accounting purposes for the state budget, he's saying, no, you spent $8.8 billion less.
Right. Yeah.
But that money did go out the door and it did get spent.
Yeah.
Okay. So, but he's not recognizing that. He's not pulling the money back because that would be havoc, political havoc.
No, it wouldn't. Yeah.
But he's not. But he doesn't want. So the way he does it is he says, well, he needs that savings. He needs that minimum Prop 98 guarantee for the past year because he's getting $8 billion in savings in it. So he's assuming, well, they spent the minimum.
Yeah. Okay.
But they didn't. And then the way he makes up for that is in 5 future budgets, it's going to be an interest-free loan. It'll be $1.6 billion in the next budget, and that he'll recognize those expenditures. One more thing on that. That $8.8 billion payback to account for this maneuver for 22-23, 100% of that comes from the non-98 side of the budget, which means every single other state program is going to get hit harder.
Yep.
And one more thing, when I talked about what's not good about the budget, we can talk about NOL in a second, but the state worker or the state government 8% unallocated cut, it's about $2.5 billion. For sure, you can find efficiencies in state government bureaucracies, no question about that. The problem with the governor's approach is it's completely unallocated, which means you, as an appropriator and as a policymaker, you have zero knowledge of what the executive branch is going to do to come up with those savings.
Yeah.
The worst type of cut you can make from a transparency standpoint, from an accountability standpoint, is to make an unallocated cut. Because you're basically saying, I don't care how you do it, just spend less. Yeah. Well, as a policymaker, you do care how they do it.
Right. Yeah.
So the 8% unallocated cut was something he probably had to do in terms of getting some savings out of the bureaucracy. But making it unallocated. Furthermore, the Department of Finance isn't even going to start figuring out how to do that until this fall, which means he's going to get tremendous erosion of that savings.
Yeah.
The $2.5 billion they scored in the budget is going to be a much smaller number when they have to update the budget next year because they don't even know what they're going to do at this point. Yeah. So that's another problem.
That's a good point. Yeah.
We'll talk taxes?
Yeah. May revision proposes a sweep to 10,000 vacant positions and imposes this is what you're referring to.
So that's
7.95% across the board reduction to state operations. So that's the provision you're referring to.
Excuse me, I didn't mean to step on you. So
no, you're good.
So the 10,000 vacant positions is part of it. Eliminating 10,000 positions sounds kind of sexy, but they're vacant. There's nobody in them.
Yeah.
Right? So you might as well eliminate those positions if there's nobody in them.
Yeah, it doesn't really harm anyone either.
No, but it's an unallocated cut is what it is.
Yeah, we can talk taxes. I think, a couple other notes before we go into that. There's a lot of talk about the MCO tax,
right.
these Medi-Cal provider rates that were agreed that we were going to increase these rates in exchange for a tax increase on providers, essentially, that will help increase these rates. There's now talk that those funds are going to be rated, that the rates are actually going to be the rate increases are going to be delayed. This is a huge problem for our hospitals and our Medi-Cal program, and really for access at the end of the day, for healthcare access in California, because these rates are historically just way too low to encourage providers to participate in them. They have to go up. So this is another thing we're going to have to be grappling with as well.
I'm so glad you brought that up, and I'm so glad you've got a firm grasp of it. I just hope your colleagues do. You know, there was a deal made last year. I think it was Senate bill. The Senate bill was SB 525. No, that was the minimum wage.
That was the minimum wage.
That's a different issue.
Which is another topic.
That's another topic. Okay, but on the MCO, but there was a deal, and the deal was, we're going to agree to do these higher taxes, but we're going to take that money, and in part, we're going to use it to pay higher provider rates. Now, some people may be sitting out there saying, why do I care about provider rates? Doctors make a lot of money. You got doctors, you got hospitals. The point is that if I'm a doc and I can't cover my costs seeing Medi-Cal patients, I'm going to stop seeing them.
You're not going to see Medi-Cal patients.
So like you just said, this is an access issue. Every time the rates get more out of alignment, the harder it is for poor people on Medi-Cal to go see a doc. They have longer wait times. They may not be able to get the procedures they want. So this really matters. It's a big deal. It should really matter to Democrats and Republicans. I'm really glad that you brought that up.
Absolutely. And to your point about SB 525, the minimum wage healthcare worker. So the governor signed this bill last year to raise, workers in the healthcare space to $25 an hour minimum wage. Now, he then quickly turned around and realized, I don't know. I'm sure he knew this when he signed it, but he quickly turned around and said, whoa, that is going to cost our state budget because we pay a lot of these people through our state budget.
That's right.
Something like $4 billion.
That's right.
And so now that looks like that's going to be delayed.
Yeah, but he hasn't so this is another area that you can be critical of the governor in terms of transparency.
Sure.
He's not showing in his budget the effect of SB 525 and raising the minimum wage for healthcare workers. It doesn't go straight to 25, but it does over a period of time. It's gradually brought in to higher minimum wage. But you're right, that has a huge impact on the state budget. And they're not reflecting that, in part because the governor continues to say, well, the legislature is going to send me a bill delaying it. Have you seen such a bill?
I have not.
Have any of your colleagues talked about such a bill?
I have not seen that, no.
I haven't heard about it. I'm tracking all the legislation.
So he's counting on the legislature to basically delay that.
And it's not reflected in his budget. So that's a real transparency issue.
Well, and this budget goes to the legislature next. So we're going to have these conversations. But to your point about tax increases, let's talk about, and this will be the last topic because I know you got we've all got a lot going on, and I really want to respect your time. But the governor has at different points said he doesn't want to raise taxes. Okay, fine. I agree with him on that. The problem is some of the actions he's taking will in some ways reflect as a tax increase because number one, he's proposing to cut a number of tax credits, which I think you could, I think even the LAO is like, okay, that should probably be looked at. But then also he's proposing to suspend the ability for businesses to deduct net operating losses from, future years. Talk to us. Can you just tell us a little bit, like, what are NOLs?
Yeah.
And why is this?
Why does it matter?
Why does it matter? Yeah.
So NOL, thank you. This is a great topic. I'll be as succinct as I can. NOL stands for net operating loss. So it's called an NOL carry forward, net operating loss carry forward. And the concept here is tax fairness. There are some industries like the movies, for example, where they'll have big profits one year and big losses the next. Well, if they get taxed based upon their big profit year, they're going to pay a huge amount in taxes.
Right.
But then they're going to have this big loss year and they don't get any benefit from that. And so the idea is other businesses whose profits and expenses or whose revenue and expenses are more closely aligned over a long period of time, they'll pay less taxes than the company that has all the volatility.
Yeah.
So in order to encourage investment in the state of California for these types of industries that have this volatility, like I mentioned, it's a big issue in the entertainment industry. It's a big issue in the technology industry, which is a huge economic driver in the state. NOL is meant to smooth things out. Now, the ledge analyst was very critical of the
Yes.
governor's move to suspend NOL. We get about just under $1 billion in savings in the budget year, but in budget year plus one, it's $5 billion.
Okay.
And in budget year plus two, it's another $5 billion. So it's a lot of money. He's really counting
Right.
on it. But the analyst points out, and I'm quoting from them, they say, if the legislature adopts the governor's NOL proposal and it takes effect, the state will have disallowed NOL deductions in nearly half of the years
Yep.
between 2008 and 2027. So that begs the question, if during that 20-year period of time, half of the years you're not using NOL, if the legislature and governor are really serious, maybe they should just repeal the whole thing. That's going to be a 2/3 vote. That is a tax increase on the NOL.
Yeah. Well, and they even say here that, and that was the exact part I was going to read, because the legislative analyst, I think, rightfully points out, it seems reasonable to ask whether suspensions to solve budget problems, right, of this NOL deduction have begun to meaningfully undermine the purpose of allowing NOL deductions in the first place.
Exactly.
If businesses can't rely on this policy that has been promised to them, and they're just going to get it taken away, all the time, then it really, like, what business is going to long term want to invest, right?
It's another reason
knowing this could be pulled out from under them.
It is another reason to not invest in California.
Yeah.
To not expand in California. It's another thorn in our side of being a tax unfriendly state and a business unfriendly state. There's one more small budget item I think is worth mentioning here. It's a small one, but I think it's an important one. I mentioned that the governor's revenue estimate, you mentioned actually the governor's revenue estimate has been lowered from January, but it's still higher than the analysts. But even just taking the governor's revenue estimate as it is, there's something in here that I find really concerning as sort of a fiscal nerd. We know that the capital gains taxes dropped dramatically.
Yes.
And that's driving a lot of this. And that's well known that we've talked about that before. But what I noticed in looking at the May revised numbers is if you look at the difference between the current fiscal year and the budget year and look at the difference between Jan 10 and the May revise, sales tax revenue is coming down year over year. That means people are buying less stuff.
Yep.
That isn't very common. If you look at, there's almost always an increase in taxable sales. And when I worked for Schwarzenegger, we had a year-over-year drop in sales tax revenue, taxable sales. It was the first time in the state of California's history since they started keeping those records that happened.
Wow.
That was going into the Great Recession. So when I look at the governor's revenue numbers, we know Pitt's down, capital gains is down, corporate taxes are down. That's pretty well known, but most people aren't talking about the sales tax. It's only $2.3 billion that is down. But that's a big deal. That's an indication of a more systematic slowdown in the economy that our sales taxes are dropping. So as looking to the future and looking at our economic forecast and our revenue forecast, that concerns me.
That is concerning because it's essentially a better measure probably of how everyday Californians are behaving. Right?
Exactly.
How their fiscal habits are, how essentially the current economy is affecting them.
That's right.
And I do think that is, I actually had not seen that. So thank you for pointing that out. I think that's an amazing, really an amazing place to end this discussion for today. I really appreciate you coming on and breaking down some of this stuff because
is it helpful for you?
It's extremely helpful. I think a lot of listeners, may hear this and go, there is so many, and we barely even dug into it, right? And there's just so much going on with this budget. But there's going to be so many of these conversations that are going to need to happen over the next really only month because we have to pass a state budget by June 15th in theory, although there's always budget trailer bills after the fact. And so very helpful. I appreciate you demystifying this for us, as you mentioned, because I do think that is really what we need to see. And I think, the mainstream media really doesn't get a lot of time to digest these things because they happen like this, right? And so having these opportunities where we can dive in a little deeper, I think is really helpful. It's one of the points of this podcast. So,
well, thank you very much for the opportunity to come on and have the conversation. You are exceptionally well versed in the budget. You're not even on the budget committee, so it's very impressive, and it was great to have this conversation with you.
I am not on the budget committee, and over the next month, I'm kind of glad that I'm not because I think there's going to be some late nights going on here. But my colleagues are going to be keeping in touch with me on what's going on, and we'll definitely report back in another few weeks on how this turns out and how the legislature maybe feels differently which, is going to be an interesting debate. Well, thank you so much for coming on today. I think the only announcement I have is that next week we're actually going to have Senator Scott Wilk on the show. It's his first time on the show, so that'll be fun. I don't get a lot of senators in here, It's
That's great. I love
the
Senator
lowly
Wilk.
assembly members, right? So, it's funny. I walked on the Senate floor the other day to work on a bill that I was working on. I needed some senator support, and so I was talking to a couple people, and my senator Roger Nilo in my district saw me, and he's like, "What are you doing here? You're just an assembly member." And he never fails to give me a hard time. I love it. So, but it was pretty funny. It was weird. It's different on that red carpet. It's a little more. It's a smaller floor. It's a lot different in there.
He's a very thoughtful member of the legislature, and boy, I'll tell you, Roger Nilo really knows the state budget too.
Oh yeah, and he may have to get him on in a few weeks to talk more.
He'd be a great guest for you.
He was on a few weeks ago actually, and we talked a little bit about the budget.
Awesome.
But really appreciate it, Tom. If you want to share ideas for future shows, you can email pointoforderpod@gmail.com. You can listen on Spotify or Apple Podcasts, watch, subscribe, and follow on YouTube, Twitter, X, Instagram, Threads, and Facebook @pointoforderpod. And you can follow me on Twitter @Joshua_Hoover. Do you have a somewhere we can follow you? Or
just SheehyStrategyGroup.com on the internet.
All right.
And at Twitter, it's @Sheehy Strategy, I believe. Yeah.
Awesome. Yeah, awesome. Well, give Tom a follow. Tom, as always, amazing expertise. Appreciate you sharing with us today.
Thank you very much, Assemblyman.
See you next time.
All right.